Welcome to episode 2 of the Mindbender podcast. In this conversation, I have a chat with my friend Bree Greenberg Benjamin. Bree is a trained psychotherapist, a yoga instructor, an expert in addiction and family dynamics, as well as the founder of the Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy. This is a broad-ranging and fascinating conversation as we discuss topics such as spiritual awakening, the cycles of emergence, consciousness's role in all of it, and the dark times associated with the emergence of these energies, often known as the dark night of the soul. And we discuss Bree's experience as a psychotherapist working help support people through these cycles of time. I hope you engage with this conversation with an open heart and a curious mind as you consider what might be possible in the realm of consciousness as new energies awaken in this world. I would also like to take a moment to thank the first sponsor of the Mindbender podcast, Honeybee Hemp Farms. Honeybee Hemp Farms is a honey and hemp farm located in Louisville, North Carolina. They practice regenerative agriculture while supporting the local pollinator population. They also practice energy healing modalities and infuse all of their work with the life force energy abundant in nature, working directly with practices such as Reiki to infuse their work with love and compassion. Honeybee Hemp Farms creates honey products as well as dog treats and dog biscuits, utilizing both the honey from their farm as well as locally grown and sustainable hemp. I'm happy to be partnering with them and to have them as the first sponsor of this podcast. You can check them out in the description below and use the code MINDBENDER at checkout. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and namaste. Bree, welcome to the Mindbender podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Reed. I'm super psyched for us to chat.
Likewise. I know this is going to be a fantastic conversation, just coming off of some of the conversations we've already had and just the depth I know that you can explore these ideas with me. So just jumping into it right off the bat, I'll get a little bit of introduction about you, and I'd love to kind of give you the chance to talk about your experience as the founder of the Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy. And really, I'd like to kind of start off with a structured question of what is psychotherapy and how have you brought it into the center that you've created, and just kind of let you go from there with what you'd like to talk about.
What is psychotherapy? Oh my God. Like hitting me with the hard questions.
Starting broad.
No. I think the history of psychotherapy kind of dictates all of these changes and evolutions over time. The study or the analysis or the understanding of the depth of the human psyche, which, translates beyond personal psychology into kind of like ancestral collective lineage, as well as kind of soul weaving or soul work. I think now is moving into more somatic realms and more realms of like larger consciousness. But typically psychotherapy has been the analysis of what's happening inside of yourself. And how do you make sense of that? And how does that guide or inform the way that you move through your world?
So saying something broad, like what's going on inside of yourself, maybe how, going off of there, how is it different from something like cognitive behavioral therapy? Where does psychotherapy, where is really the niche that it fills that's unique from other types of therapeutic modalities?
I think of psychotherapy as being kind of a big catch-all. So I would think it as being an umbrella term that includes something like cognitive behavioral therapy. You have all of these kind of factions or technologies or ways that we have developed or used former developments in order to work with and parse out what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the larger cosmology of the being. And so, yeah, the center was kind of formed from my work in systems therapy. So I'm a marriage and family therapist by training. And my tendency is to look not at the individual, but to look at their meta or larger system, both internally and externally, and to look at the way that all of those pieces are combining and cooperating. Even if they feel disharmonious, they're still cooperating in some sort of way. And so I like to look at architecture and structures. And the center was born from that, from like this desire to create a place where we would have a tight team of multidisciplinary practitioners. And those practitioners would be looking at what's happening in the structure of the individual at a depth or foundational level, and what are the occlusions to that individual's fuller expression.
So there's so much to unpack there already. And I know I jumped into it very early with the broad question of what is psychotherapy, but I think this is going to be really a conversation of unpacking that idea. And so I'd love to kind of go into your experience leading up to starting the therapy center. And then I imagine as the conversation progresses, I'd love to talk about more of the work you've done at the center. But kind of going back a little bit to what actually brought you to creating this center in the first place, what are some of the expertise, really going back to, you're talking about the cosmology of the individual and internal and external structural dynamics of the psyche. And there's a lot to unpack there with kind of those broader ideas. And so I'd love to know what background you are bringing into these. I know that you're a trained psychotherapist and also have experience with yoga and family counseling. So kind of in just a broad level, what are the different domains of expertise? Because I know you're not coming at this with a unimodal approach. You have a lot of different modalities you're bringing into these ideas. So if you kind of walk us through what those are and how you tie them all together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my whole experience has been one of synthesis or synergy. So when I was in my 20s, I had a pretty big health crisis and began to seek out, at the time, kind of alternative methods for treating that, which led me down many different rabbit holes, particularly in like the late 90s and the early 2000s, where those things were not as common in both our languaging or the availability of that kind of treatment.
Are you talking about more just Eastern practices in general?
Yeah, Eastern practices, even acupuncture, things like muscle testing. I mean, anything that had to do with vibrational medicine, homeopathy. At that time, we weren't really including very many of those things in our languaging or in our kind of schematic about treatment. It was very narrow. So I started pursuing all of those things. And at the time I was working with teenage girls and their families and was finding that there was kind of this subset of teenage girls who had this particular kind of pattern consistently, which was that they were high achieving, whether they were like super smart or not, they were high achieving. They were very creative. They were highly aware. They were super capable, and they were generally having eating disorders. And so I started becoming curious about like why this pattern was showing up so consistently with eating disorder clients. I knew nothing about eating disorders at the time. And I began to kind of go down this rabbit hole of like, how do I look for something that is going to have more efficacy than the current treatment models, which were considerably failing? Like the
and this
recidivism
is specifically
rate,
targeting eating disorders.
Yes. I mean, the recidivism rate was so high. So, you were looking at basically this resilient and resistant pattern in the way that eating disorders showed up. And so, of course, I was like a moth to the flame with that. I was like, oh, no one knows what they're doing there. I got to figure out what the hell's going on.
Find the biggest problem, find the toughest thing you can address and go all in. Yeah, I love that's a really cool approach. Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's always been like that for me, which is that, I'm kind of looking for the edges of experience And I'm looking for the places where those edges are like untapped and can inform the bigger picture. So anyway, I started.
What is it about eating disorders specifically that you think fell on that edge? What is it about that particular disorder? And I know we had this conversation. I would love for you to correct me on why it might not even be correct to call it a disorder, but why that specifically at the edge?
Oh my gosh, it took me so many years to really understand that question. So I used to think that that was because you can't give up food in the same way that you can give up other addictions. So, it's a primary piece of the way in which you have to engage with the world. But it's so much deeper than that. It took me 20 plus years to understand that eating disorders were replicating the central architecture of kind of all of the things that we struggle with. Capitalism, racism, misogyny. Eating disorders just beautifully illustrate every part of that around things like deprivation, scarcity, withholding, eros, self-harm, punishment, satiety, like every one of those things, objectification, they are all arising in an eating disorder system, and they are all organized in the way in which that person thinks that the eating disorder is going to rescue them, and their rescuer is also their abuser.
And so you're saying that these structural patterns, these dynamics that you're seeing in the psyche in the context of eating disorders, there were common motifs that you were able to pick out structurally and kind of in the way that all of these components are tied together in the psyche of these individuals. You're saying there were common motifs that you could pick out that other people might have missed in their analyses.
Well, I think that people are aware that that's there, but first they're focused on it as being about food or the body. And it's not about that at all. I mean, it is and it isn't at all. And there's a way that if you go deeper into it, you understand that these are things that every one of us is struggling with, particularly in a Western capitalist society. And so these all have to do with enslavement and liberation. And so once I started understanding that it wasn't just the components, but the ways in which those components cooperated, that was consistent over time, not just in eating disorders, but in many other kind of meta processes of enslavement, I began to track and map those things over and over again so that I could create cosmology maps and begin to understand how to work with those systems consistently with the same maps, because they had the same, doesn't matter what the story is. People's stories all vary, but the way in which the configuration of these components cooperate is consistent over time, even if the expression is slightly variable.
So I think it'd be really helpful. I'd be very curious if you could kind of walk through maybe an example of how in your head you're kind of structuring these maps, because I imagine that even as we're talking about this and the course of this discussion might already have gone over the heads of some people who are very entrenched in that Western modality of medicine where it's symptom management. You have an eating disorder. Okay, well, there is something there. We can give you a pill to treat obesity. We can give you a pill to treat your cravings. We can change your diet. There's things that we can do at the surface that might treat the symptoms. But what you're saying is there is something deeper in the structural dynamics. And again, I'd really like to unpack what those are and how those interplay in the psyche of the individual that's leading to the manifestation of these symptoms being an eating disorder. And so to really kind of track it back into, for the people who don't really have any context for, okay, well, what is a structure of the psyche? How do these things interplay in the dynamics of a mind? And how could there possibly be common motifs across individuals, irrespective of culture or whatever? So it would be really helpful, I think, if you could kind of paint and walk through the process of, in your mind, what do these structural dynamics look like and how do they kind of paint this picture that leads to the symptoms that most people focus on?
So these are, I would say that, again, it's not so much about it being an eating disorder. It's about actually like addictive structures.
Hmm.
And addictive structures are broader than if you use a substance or if you're struggling with food. So addictive structures have to do with recursive patterns, like things that happen over and over again that have to do with chasing or externalization or trying to reduce pain or suffering through some sort of external object or situation. And that precludes you from ever getting underneath what I call the double bind. And underneath the double bind is kind of your core expression. So I know this is kind of complicated, which is what you're asking me to unpack. And the easiest way I would say it is that we have a natural form of movement. So our natural form of movement has to do with the ways in which energy, or our kind of selfhood, which goes beyond self, but is more just the way that we would wake up, the way that we would begin interacting with the world. It has a kind of natural cadence to it. And that naturalness has periods of expansion, periods of contraction, periods of hiding, periods of being exposed, right? It's the way that nature interacts with itself all the time. And all of these things, eating disorders included, capitalism, eating disorders, misogyny, the patriarchy, it doesn't really matter what the thing is, but these are all trying to harness that natural movement into a particular pattern or shape that really is in compliance in order to keep you in some sort of relationship where you are needing that food or that relationship in order to theoretically survive or to exist is actually what it really is. I talk a lot about existence, which goes beyond survival and goes beyond kind of the compensation to not having existence. And it is expression, right? So speaking is expression, movement is expression, breath is expression. So at its base, what we're looking at in this model is where expression, particularly things like primal body expression, which are basic needs, basic expressions, where those things have been hindered or oppressed or suppressed. When that happens for long enough, the system develops this very elegant solution. And that solution is to create basically these overlapping addictive or recursive cycles in order to cope with the absence of that natural movement or expression. So when symptoms appear, right? So if you're a Western physician or a Western trained psychologist and you are looking directly at just the symptom, I train those people to pay attention to the languaging of the symptom. And that's the languaging in the body. It's the linguistics around it. If you start to pay attention to the subtleties around the languaging of the symptom, you will already see embedded in it the occlusion. And that occlusion is often trauma-based. It's an occlusion that has to do with a time, maybe in your life or before your life, where there was an experience of having to choose between your own natural movement or expression and death, some form of death, whether that be exile, physical death, emotional death. So there was a significant threat because we don't change our natural movement unless we experience a significant threat to us changing it, not changing that. Sorry.
Yeah. So if I could take all of that, and I'd love to have the chance to kind of recompile it in my own language in a way that I think I'm picking up what you're saying in my own head. And then I would love for you to tell me where I'm wrong, where there needs to be adjustments, and kind of add your own embellishments to this kind of central theme I'm beginning to pull out what you're saying. But we all have this, I would call it a genius. We have an energy, a personal livelihood, a spirit that wants to express itself in our lives and through our actions. And this is, taking it outside of the domain of human personality and just look at nature at large. Nature kind of has a natural flow to it. Things are happening. Species have their niche. The world moves along in its own natural flow. And there are certain things that might happen, like roadblocks, that get in the way of what would otherwise be that natural flow of life. And when that happens, whether it's through a trauma, through life taking unexpected turns, through a way that we build up energy in the system, that I think you used the word like an obstacle, like a something stopping that. An occlusion was the word that you used, like a blockage in a pipe, almost stopping the natural flow of the energy. And when that happens, it cuts off a piece of our consciousness. It cuts off a piece of our psyche that wants to be expressed, but we are now no longer allowing it to express itself through us. And then when that happens, we form these loops. We form these recursions that, because of the pain of that part of our psyche, that part of our consciousness being cut off from expression, it's almost like a diversion of that energy into these recursive loops of addiction that don't actually serve the genius that wanted to come through in the expression in the first place. But it's a compensation mechanism to give that energy something to do in place of its lack of proper expression.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that the genius part is really connected to the purity of innocence. And this isn't innocence as a kind of like innocence or guilt. This is a clear expression that is very clean. It's unhindered. It's unbiased by all of the layers that we build up, which are actually just lies that get piled on top of it. So part of the process of getting to this is really kind of unwinding the knots. And those are in the body, those are in the field, those are in the psyche. So it's unwinding these places of holding that are kind of containing pieces of our expression or our innocence that want to be in flow.
It's like tangles in an otherwise flowing net of energy.
Yeah, exactly. And what you find, of course, is that there's just more available chi there, right? The whole being is brighter. There's more aliveness. There's more vibrancy. And that
when those obstructions are blown through and are opened up.
Totally. And it's not going sideways. You can still have access to a lot of juice in your life. But if there's a lot of like occlusions, or there's a primary place where there's strong avoidance of honesty, what's going to happen is that juice will go sideways. And so we know that. We know this when we're with people. We feel these kinds of things. We feel the availability, the honesty, the truthfulness of somebody's expression, regardless of what their words are, but just in the ways in which they are showing up to meet life.
So kind of bringing this back into your therapeutic work, we mentioned that you are, you teach and practice yoga as a part of as a therapeutic modality, but also just with your direct clinical work as a psychotherapist. And you mentioned acupuncture, all of these different modalities, but kind of returning back to this idea of the actual clinical practice around this and less around the ideas underlying it. When you're describing untangling these knots, right? Smoothing out the web so you can get rid of those occlusions and the energy can flow more freely into a more honest expression. What does that look like therapeutically? What does the process of untangling those knots look like in your work?
So when I had the center, what we did was we created teams of people who would look at the ways in which those blockages were present for people. And we would try to work directly with them in a variety of different ways. Again, it could be through talking with somebody. It could be through parts. I mean, there's so much to this. Like, I've developed an entire tome of training this that kind of encapsulates a whole way of working. But essentially, we look at this as a maturational model and a developmental one. So placing people's kind of primary consciousness at one stage of maturation or a few stages or a range of maturation is one of the ways that it helps a team of people guide and understand how to cooperate around working with that person. You're also looking at primary things like gut health, hormone levels, right? So there's some basic biology that you're trying to support into more healthfulness as you're doing other pieces of the work. So I would evaluate somebody, or one of my employees would evaluate somebody using this kind of multimodal intake process that I had created. And we would be looking for markers or ideas about where some of the current symptoms tracked back to, but also what was happening for that person in the now, what needed to be shored up, what needed to be supported, what needed to be let go. And we were never dictating those things, but we were creating these kind of cosmology imprints of people that then we could follow over time as we continued to kind of shift around their care.
Could you unpack, we've used the word cosmology a couple of times, and I think for a lot of listeners, the correlation, the connection between cosmology and psychotherapy or things like eating disorders is not necessarily a clear one. I'd love for you to kind of unpack as you're building these maps. When you say these cosmological structures of the psyche, what is that? What do you mean by that? How does something as grandiose as the cosmos play into an individual's psyche?
Well, just because we're not something. So I think the thing is that we think we're like this person or this body, but the reality is what we are is this kind of overlapping, always cooperating, multimodal expression of different reality fields. So, the self that we think we are is really just a structure that is built from many different components that we have identified with and have kind of melded together into this kind of form that we are used to and that we feed every day and take care of every day as if it is going to go on forever.
Well, but in our heads, right? Because we have this conception of a self that's very real to us subjectively. We feel like separate individuals. I feel like I have a unique identity that is separate from you, Bree. But what you're saying is that there's a level of psychotherapy and a level of our psychology beyond that breaks through those individual differences and is better characterized as kind of this field of energy that we are all channeling through, and that energy gets tangled in my individual container and your individual container, but the energy itself is still universal.
The energy itself is still universal, and each person's is different because my ancestry is different than yours, and where I grew up is different than yours. So the way that we collect these different experiences is part of what creates and births these different reality fields that we know as ourselves. The central part of that we become most familiar with is what we often identify with as like ourself. And so there's parts of it that are indivisible, as you're speaking of, where like it's universal. But there's also pieces that are kind of individual in the way that we have experienced ourselves over time and our history and our repetitiveness of experience and the familiarity with that. What I'm saying, I think, is that this goes so far beyond psychotherapy. I mean, I don't actually ever refer to myself as a psychotherapist anymore. Because I think it's become so misleading because what we attribute to psychotherapy is so much narrower than this. And this is really an understanding of what really is here. Not what I think should be here or what I experience as being here, but this is like the thing. This is what it really is. We are just these things. And we're always kind of giving birth to something new all the time, whether we recognize that or not. And we are also always killing off something within us all the time. And so we're always undergoing this transmutation process. Some of the arcs of that transmuting are much longer. Some of the arcs are immediate and very short, just like cell turnover. Do you know what I mean? Some of it is shorter and some of it is much longer.
Well, and to the point you had made before, if there are biological deaths, both in like our body, right? We have cell turnover. We live for a whole lifetime. So however many years an individual lasts for, that's a birth and a death. But you can fraction that out into an infinitude of little deaths, right?
Yes.
Our cells are dividing, we're undergoing radioactive decay. There's an incalculable number of deaths happening within ourselves every single moment. And going even into the psyche, one idea that I love is, this was a Carl Jung idea, I believe, but it's the sense that one thing that's unique about human consciousness is that we have come to the recollection that these deaths begin to happen, and there is something unique about humans in our experience where we don't have to wait for the biological death, because we can have ideas and we can allow our ideas to die before we do. And so there's this constant turnover in our life as we're living through ideas and living through knowledge that we can learn and allow the previous identity of who I was, the previous knowledge of what I knew about the world, the previous ideas and conceptions I held about the world around me. Those can continually die and then be born again. And so it's this, like, we're shortening the time frame at which these deaths and rebirths are happening.
Yeah, and I would say that in general, the length of that time frame of those deaths around identity is usually only longer because we get very attached to those things. And because in the Western world, we tend to veer very far away from death. It doesn't feel like an ally, it feels like an enemy. And so because of that, we have this orientation with the preservation of life as kind of being the gold standard. But in elevating that preservation, we have artificially moved away from the natural process of death. And so that has created so much of this addictive cycling. It's the always chasing of like the eternal holding of life. And the irony is that by doing that, we've actually lost access to life. Like, we've actually created a whole false realm of living that is pretty empty. And that's why you see tremendous amount of mental health and addiction happening in the world right now, because it's hitting these crests or crisis points that are very high about being disconnected from one's own nature, one's own true expression. And even what we have out there now to remedy it only goes about an eighth of the way into actually taking you through that journey. And so it's very complicated right now in the fact that that hunger is very strong and amplifying, but our technology and our ability to teach and create is very low.
Well, and we see this in palliative care, right? Where so much of the Western idea of health is it's entirely the objective function you're optimizing for is days alive. That's it. So it's, you know, if somebody is diagnosed with terminal cancer and there's two options of, we can prolong your life by 2 months with iterative rounds of chemo and you'll be miserable. You're going to have a horrible end of your life. You'll be bedridden, but hey, we can draw it out for an additional 3 months. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I think the advances in medicine there are beautiful, but really when it comes down to the option of, you know, you can have a kind of confrontation with death and actually allow it to be something that transforms your consciousness and brings you closer to the people around you, and recognize that this is the natural course of things and come to terms with it in a beautiful way, rather than fighting tooth and nail to add those extra days onto the end and making yourself miserable in the process. I'm not making a value judgment one way or another, but the point that we have as a society become so hyper obsessed on the latter without giving any thought to the former, I think points what you're saying of how we really are focusing so much on that biological life and death timeline of a full lifetime, and not taking into account this idea that we're realistic. I mean, if you really dive into it psychologically, we are dying and being reborn every moment of our lives to the extent that we can become aware of it.
Yeah, and I think that thread is the one that connects really strongly with control. And so this is about like the advancement or the overzealous desire to be in some sort of control of life. And we have oversold that like crazy to the point at which it feels like if you're not in control, you are in collapse. And if you're in collapse, you're impotent. And all of this is part of the structure of the double binds that I speak and teach about.
I don't want to, I know you have a thought going, and I hate to cut you off, but you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'd love if we could maybe pull back a second and zoom out and say, what is the double bind as you're referring to it? Because I imagine it will come up in more points of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the double bind was originally coined by Gregory Bateson, and he talked about it in reference to kids who had schizophrenic mothers and became schizophrenic. But it's a much broader term than that. And in the way that I use it, it really is about being exposed to abusive systems that put you in no-win situations. So that's where you have seeming choices, and both of those choices are bad. And everybody is familiar with this, right? Like you want to leave your job that you're really unhappy with because you feel depressed going every day because it's not your calling, but you have health insurance there. And if you leave and you lose your health insurance, your kids will lose their health insurance. And how will your family survive without health insurance? There's 1,000 things that you can think of with that, but that's just a very simple kind of way. And we're filled with them in this culture. And all of those things ask us to compromise a core part of our movement, either for our belonging or our survival or the well-being of somebody that is important to us, like our children. And those compromises become collected over time to a space in which you can no longer feel yourself, to where your primary, and where your primal body becomes so frozen with feeling threatened that you are constantly in your own version of control. And so part of what we have going on right now is that the ways we usually address this is like cognitive behavioral therapy, or we look at like, you know, some breath work or some yoga, and those things are all good, but they only take you down a few layers. And what's underneath there is really this choice about existence and this fear that if you make a wrong choice, you won't exist, and that there is no right choice. So the double bind is interesting in that it sets up a seeming binary. And what should come out of that binary is kind of this new or creative third route, right? This is this other way that would be emergently created in response to a no-win situation that would actually allow the entirety of the organizational structure, both within you and external to you, to find new paths. And so there's a genius here in this. But because our somatic and energetic bodies have been exposed to so many of these no-win situations, when we experience them, we freeze. We can't move. And so because we can't move, that flow cannot happen. And what happens then is evolution stops. And this is exactly the target for the double bind. It is to stop or apprehend evolution, which, of course, if you know and understand the creative, you understand that that's the feminine. And this is about harnessing and controlling and apprehending the movement of the feminine, which is always iterating.
So we arrive at these double binds in our lives which stress us out, right? They pull us out of our parasympathetic, more restful, feminine passivity of just existence. And they bring us into this stressed out, sympathetic nervous system engagement where we're looking around and we are in this fight, flight, or paralyze mode. And in that mode where in our lives in the Western world, fight and flight really aren't options, right? We can't fight against the system and we can't run away from the system. And so we get stuck in this mode of just paralysis, which then freezes. It locks that movement of the feminine energy, of just that spaciousness that allows us to move about with kind of this awareness of what's possible. And we get stuck in our own kind of, like our feet are in concrete almost in life.
Yeah. And I would say that for a lot of these situations, one of the remedies is coalitions, because trying to kind of take on the entirety of, like you said, like the system's not interested in changing. And because it's got it good, like it's doing well if that stays the same.
Right.
And you can find this in both micro and meta systems. It happens in family systems where there's one individual who is holding the role of the primary oppressor. And that individual doesn't understand why is that child with an eating disorder complaining? Like there's nothing wrong here, right? And what that child with the eating disorder is saying is there's something vitally wrong here. And it's not just wrong for me, it's wrong for everybody. But we don't listen to that because we don't want to have to cope with the fact that the reality is that our freedom is coming at a very high cost and that it isn't actually that free.
I think there's a quote that I love, and it's that people would prefer a familiar hell than an unfamiliar heaven.
Yeah.
And that sounds like what you're describing, where people, it's not always up to them, right? This idea, I think you gave a great example of the single mother who is in a job that she hates and she's working 60 hours a week, but has to do it for the health insurance and to put food on the table because she has an objective that's more primary than her happiness or her well-being, and that's to provide for her child. And so there's this no-win situation in picking the noble option of to provide and to do what needs to be done. Again, that goes to kind of this psychological feat in concrete where you just feel like you can't move and can't do anything.
Yeah. And what happens is that the primal body's own expression of its wildness, right? Like its own kind of untethered movement patterns that can be chaotic and wild and uncertain, and that would go through its own seasons and cycles of that chaos and uncertainty, has been so bound. And that binding, again, has a very high symptom cost.
So we mentioned the feminine energy of the expression and the freedom of movement and that spaciousness. And again, I feel like I'm understanding, kind of picking up on what you're saying there, but for the benefit of the listeners, can we really dive into that, the distinction between the masculine and the feminine energy as it relates to this process of embracing the double bind, what causes the double bind, as well as eventually breaking out of it? What is the dynamic being played between the masculine and the feminine energy in that dance?
Well, so the feminine energy is the formless, right? It's the aspect that is not yet birthed into form, that is constantly kind of iterating, moving, chaotic, discordant, birthing all the time.
The pregnant void, sure.
Yeah, exactly. And the masculine is the structure. It's what assists the feminine into creating form. And so the cooperation of those two things kind of is always giving birth and creating new form with the same elements, but just in different configurations, right? All the time. And evolving its ability to create and amplify different kinds of consciousness through form.
So with that understanding, with the feminine being kind of the spaciousness of potential and the masculine being what shapes that potential, how do those two energies play when you're in the position, when you are in the context of a double bind, when you have that in your life and you feel like you're trapped, and then how can that maybe be alleviated, and what is the resolution to the warping of the masculine and feminine polarity in the context of a double bind, or in the context of an eating disorder or any addiction? How do those energies get warped? And then what is the way out of that into a more free expression?
Yeah, I mean, you have to begin to decrease the systemic inflammation, first of all, because anybody who has been in a double bind long enough has a high degree of systemic inflammation. And I mean that not just in the body, but everywhere in the whole being. So there's a piece of it that is about just beginning to bring the whole system into some sort of lower state of like reciprocity and receiving. But then you have to work on the places in the body and in the psyche where the double bind is still holding. There's beliefs that are impregnated into that, strong beliefs about you don't have a right to exist. Existence is threatening, right? You're unworthy. There's all these kind of base packed in beliefs that are close to what I call the center. And at the center is like this pulsing thing that is like your vibrant innocence that wants to be able to be unlocked. But getting to that center and unlocking it means going through tons of terror, tons of ego death, tons of, exposure to like places where you're not telling yourself the truth, whether you mean to or not, and really dissolving the structures and the beliefs and the architecture energetically and physically and psychologically that are keeping you in a space in which you think that it is too threatening to let that cat out of the bag, so to speak. And it usually happens in small ways, right? You unlock something and then there's more movement, right? And new creation starts to happen. And then sometimes people live like that for a while. And then they hit a place where they're like, oh shit, like something's coming up again. And then they're looking at it again, right? So it's like,
it's not often all at once. It's chipping away, right? You're
sometimes
slowly chipping away.
It's usually a long game. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we can have these big moments, these big kind of bell curve moments within that long game, but in general, this is a long game.
And at this point, we're not talking anymore about addictions or eating disorders specifically. This is everybody.
This is spiritual maturation. This is psychological and spiritual maturation.
And so we can talk about it in, again, I know I don't want to use the words aberration or disorder because, as you've said, it's really just differing structural dynamics that are presenting themselves in positive and negative ways. It's difficult when we're talking at it at this level to put pathologies onto it, right? Because it's more just, this is the way that the energy is configured, right? It's not good or bad. What are you going to do with it? But, there is a distinction here because some people obviously are dealing with more shit than others. Some people have really been dealt a raw deal in life and have a lot of suffering that is placed on them from their environment, from the system. And there are other people who, from anybody from the outside looking in, they have it great. Their lives are totally put together. They have everything that other people want and dream for, but they might be psychologically just as miserable.
Yes.
And so it's really, as we're talking about this, now we've kind of moved away from the domain of just psychotherapy and of treating addictions, and now into, this is really something that is universal, right?
Yes.
Everybody goes through this process. It's just we all have different shit we need to work through. We all have different double binds that need to be addressed in our lives, but we all have them.
Yes.
And so you said one thing that I really appreciate, and it says you touch that center, right? This pulsing energy in the center. So we'll dive into that rabbit hole, because what does that look like? Whether it's in the context of somebody who has dealt with a lot of trauma and is working through these double binds and slowly chipping away at those energetic knots, and all of a sudden they arrive at something in themselves, a feeling, an emotion, a presence that they've never known. And the same thing can happen from somebody who is going about their normal life and takes a psychedelic, and all of a sudden, wow, they're touching that same thing. They're in that same place. So what does it look like in the context both of psychotherapy and just in normal life, just in individuals, right? Taking it away from specific context that this can be arrived at, and just when somebody approaches that center and they have chipped away enough of the outside, they've gone through enough of these spiritual and personality deaths to begin to confront that presence. What does it look like in an individual's life, and what are some of the outpourings that happen as a result?
I will say this first, which is that like sometimes you contact that center without having done any work around chipping away. And that's part of what happens sometimes when people go to do psychedelics, kind of seeking this remediation of trauma, and they contact some of that unexpectedly, or they don't know that that's what's going to happen, and it totally blows up their life. So I think that like there is something to be said for the fact that like, you know, we can experience that just by hiking on a mountain too, and having like a moment of divinity, or just seeing somebody die that's close to us, and having those moments of deep connection. So I think for some people it comes in like a rocket, where they touch that center and it's just like there's an aliveness there and a potency that is unmistakably so strong that they hunger for it and they can't live without it. For other people, it's really peaceful and really quiet. You know, this is a multi-dimensional center. So it's not like it's one thing. It has many different expressions. And I think that you touch it over and over again until there's a place in which it flows through you in a more kind of abiding way, where it's part of it's just the way that it's informing your being as a responsive kind of emergent evolution all the time. But in general, what happens for people is that they touch it and then it ends. You know what I mean? Like they have a period which can be short or long where they're not touching it anymore. And because they're not touching it, then they want to get back to touching it. And because it felt really good. And so, you know, all of this is about learning how to deal with variance, learning how to deal with different states, and also learning what is really true in the moment, even if that's just suffering that is true in that moment, because you touch this thing and now you don't have it. There is something also about the fact that the more you touch that thing, the more expansive energy is going to be in your body. And so when that starts to kind of cycle through, it's going to take what was formed into kind of these tight balls of personality structure or ways or beliefs, and it's going to begin to break them apart. And this is where most people experience, you know, repeated dark nights, or times in which they feel what I call in the woods, where they're uncertain about what's happening, or like they're in liminal space. And that's because the old structure is not holding, but this expansive consciousness is now moving through their being, trying to look for new avenues of expression. And we don't have very good ways of dealing with that either. We tend to kind of medicate that, or we tend to think that like that should go away, like chaos is too scary and too much, and we should put it back in the box. And no one can get to the other side of that without actually going through those periods of disorganization in order to have some sort of reorganizing principle where the physics are completely different than the one you left.
Well, in this disorder, this disorganization that you're talking about, I think it goes back to, I really want to keep revisiting this. I feel like this is central to our conversation, but this idea of repeated deaths and rebirths, ideological, psychological, spiritual, physical deaths and rebirths of everything about our consciousness and our being. And that's terrifying to some people, right?
Yeah.
But to what extent is it necessary to have access to that center?
I mean, you're talking to the wrong one. Like, to me, it's vitality. Like, in the absence of that, you're starving. So I think what's interesting is that we tend to have such strong compensatory mechanisms for the avoidance of that death and transformation cycle that you were speaking about, that there's so much terror affiliated with that we have built so many structures that compensate so we don't have to go through that what happens is it like becomes forbidden. It becomes this kind of like scary zone. But once you get reoriented to the scary zone of like, oh my God, death is actually going to happen. And like, it's happening all the time. And like vibrancy is kind of part of that. Then I think it starts dropping and you become friendly with death in a very different kind of way. And that makes you resilient in a way that goes beyond the kind of built up resilience. It's a resilience that is born from being with what's really true and being in cooperation with it rather than being against it. You're riding that wave rather than trying to control that wave. And you understand that the wave crashes and you might have to wait a long ass time for the next wave. You know what I mean? And you could eat your cookies while you're waiting for the next wave, but you know that wave is going to come because it's inevitable. But you're not dependent on the wave to live. So you're not like eating cookies and getting fat and watching TV while you're waiting for the next wave because you think that nothing's happening. Something's always happening. And so I think this is that our view and our orientation is so schismed in the direction of addiction and the double bind that we don't even have this orientation, which is why when I speak about it, people are always like, what are you talking about? And then the whole thing has to like shift in its context because our contexts are just wrong. Our contexts are built on enslavement and compensation. And so any conversation that you have is going to be iterated through that filter.
Well, and I think in large part, it's because we, particularly in the West, deny that center is even there, right? Yeah. This idea that it's something that can be touched, this idea that true healing, true love and compassion, both for the world around you and for yourself, doesn't come from an ideology. It doesn't come from outside of it. It doesn't come from a relationship. It comes from that point you're describing inside of you. And the closer you touch it, the more deeply you get into it, the more freely it will move through you and the more expansive it becomes to then spread love outwardly. But we don't acknowledge that. We don't even believe that it exists.
Right.
In an atheist materialistic culture, it's just, no, we are the atoms, we are the chemistry. If you're depressed, you take a drug. And again, I'm not saying that all psychiatric drugs are bad. All I'm saying is that there is a fundamental denial of the fact that there's even another possibility. And so, to that point, how can we begin to characterize, because even now we're talking more abstractly, right, about the center or this energy or this expansive movement of the feminine potential, right? We've kind of been dancing around this idea throughout this conversation, but really just to ask the question directly and to really begin to point in another direction away from the materialistic Western culture of medicine. What is this alternative that Eastern medicine points to that, what is this center? What does it feel like? What does it mean when somebody encounters it? And how does it have this transformative power?
I mean, I think most people would say it feels like home.
Like returning.
Like belonging.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is hard because this is an experiential thing, not,
right.
Once you get 6 degrees out into language, it loses. This is why so much of this is transmitted through being with somebody who embodies that.
Mm-hmm. Because it's more of a current and less of a physical idea. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an access to a kind of vibrancy and the words that come up for me always are like, there's an echolocation that you use in order to kind of get there. And it's not that we ever don't know. It's just that we've gotten so far away from it that now we need all of these things to help us return to it.
Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to go from there and begin to talk more societally. And again, we're both out of our depths here, but as somebody who has dealt with this in psychiatric practice and has dealt with this in therapeutic modalities a lot, where is this lacking in society beyond just talking about the Western culture of medicine that doesn't recognize it? But what are some of the actual, like, I'll give an example to kind of bring this down to earth, where in India, you have the idea of ashrams. You have places where if somebody has an encounter with this personality, this current inside of themselves, it's not uncommon there's stories of people in India stripping off their clothes and running around the street naked after they've encountered this radically transformative energy inside of themselves. And it can be terrifying. It can be horribly destabilizing in your life once you have had an encounter with it. But in many Eastern cultures, there's places you can go. If they see somebody running around the street naked, they're going to say, oh, they're intoxicated with the divine, and take them to an ashram where they'll be cared for. Here, right, you'll be locked in prison. Yeah. And so what, in your estimation, I know that this is part of what you were attempting and really brought to fruition and brought into the world with your center in Vermont, but kind of talking more broadly, what are some ideas in your estimation? What are the institutions, the social groups, and the places, the physical locations, the spaces that need to be opened up to allow for this kind of energy to break through? Because one thing that I've recognized that it's happening with increasing frequency. More and more people are having these types of experiences. More and more people are facing these questions and are having that type of intoxication where they're running around completely dumbfounded and don't know how to integrate it into their lives. So I'd love to shift this to the point of integration and say, we've moved from pathology and we are now into the point of integration. What do you do?
Yeah. I mean, that's how, when I closed the center and spent the last couple of years looking at the model and thinking about what to do with it next, my primary kind of aim has been to bring this kind of model into existing systems. Because what I really believe is that what we don't need is to start building a whole bunch of other places for people to go that are segregated away from society. One of the problems is that people have these kind of huge disruptive events, partially because earlier on in the process, there wasn't any care model that really understood where they were. So it becomes this big kind of huge psychotic looking or bipolar looking thing, partially because the backlog is so high. So to me, we should be using this orientation from the time people, come in for care, whatever kind of care they're coming in, whether that's physical care, mental health, emotional care, right? This isn't nothing. We've made everything so separate, and it's not meant to be like that. We have to understand how humans mature and how the maturing process is not just psychological or responsibility or spiritual, but it is a conglomeration of all of those things that are always happening at different rates within that person, but that there should be places all over the place where we understand that assisting that looks a particular way. And that it is not about disrupting that or managing that, but it is about scaffolding that so the being can do what they would naturally do, and that process will arc and resolve and lead to another arc and resolution. And
to the point of it looks different in everybody, right? The energy that's being brought forth, it doesn't have a cookie cutter motif. It's unique and individual. And
Yeah.
I think that gets to this point of, you're not trying to curate a course of care. You're trying to create a space where people can go through this arc themselves.
Correct. And understanding that, like, there isn't this one center of divinity that's so coveted that you have to get to it. Like, this is always alive in us, or what I call the field of existence is always here. And so learning to access the field of existence is something that I teach about in this model, where, like, the field of existence doesn't just come after the trauma work. No. It's always there. You don't have to be you're already there. You just don't know that it's there, and you don't really know what to do with it. And so to me, this is just a whole different frame that, like, should be there in high schools, should be there in colleges when kids go to the counseling center or the health center, should be there. It's just a way. It's a way. And so I think that would decrease significantly the need for people to have these big, giant disruptive moments where they're burning down the entirety of their life because they've just figured out that for 40 years, it's all been shit. You know what I mean?
The foundation, the cornerstone has been shook to the point where you're left with nothing to stand on. And I feel like that's what's happening more and more, especially as psychedelics have become far more prevalent in society. And again, and goes back to the conversation I had with David Field, and we're having it now, of there's no one way to access that divinity within. There's no one right way to tap that center and to feel that pulsing energy alive in you. Again, you already have it. You already are it.
Yes.
But the question of then, when people recognize that, because so many people just either have never been told that it's there, have never even had it as a concept that's been floated in their lives before, or there's a really, really violent and strong aversion against even considering it might be real.
Yes.
But then, so you have almost like this precondition against it. It's not even that you're ambivalent or open to the possibility. It's that so many people are avidly fighting against it. And then from that point of consciousness, if then you take a psychedelic, or you try a really intense breathwork session, or you are on top of a mountain and just the awe hits you, or some incredible point of suffering hits your life and you're left with no firm ground to stand on and you're questioning everything. When all of that happens and then this breaks through in your life, we're describing it as this love, as this sense of presence, this source. But, even considering that, because of how much resistance is built up a priori, it can be a violent encounter. It can be something that breaks down the entire structure of your life. And so how do we play with that polarity of this, on one hand, being a beautiful experience that is happening more and more in the world? People are hearing about psychedelics and want to try them. Everybody wants to try it, but people don't often know what they're getting into. And so they have these experiences that, as we talked about in our last conversation, pull you out of or throw you into the cave. And you mentioned Dark Night as well. What do you do when you've had that type of experience that you didn't believe was possible, and or you were fighting against, but all of a sudden you're wide open to it? What happens in the psyche at that moment?
I mean, I think then the psyche kind of competes with itself about what's true, and it challenges formerly held beliefs and ideologies that maybe are much kind of longer than you, that may have gone through your family or your lineage for a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think any of that is ever the problem. It's that we don't really have spaces for integration that go deep enough or wide enough to handle the complexity, as you're saying, of what can come up individually in a person. The thing is that there's a lot of complexity, but really it's also very simple. Like, it's not that many things. And so part of the problem is the models we have now don't go deep enough to mine the places that give birth to all of this variance. And so they see the variance as the thing. The variance is never the thing. The thing is always reduced down to the fact that there are beliefs or ideologies or identities that are connected to a certain way of being that are now being challenged. And that is going to be where the rubber hits the road, and there's going to have to be some alchemy that happens there. And how do you support that kind of alchemy in an individual who can't give up where they came from, nor should they, but also is aware now of something else that challenges what they formerly held as being true?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is flexibility, right? This is the ability to take on new information and incorporate it. And that happens sometimes quickly or over a long time. But this is what grows an individual or a society into a robustness and an ability to embrace way, way more gray, way outside of the binaries. And right now we have a society that really likes binaries.
Well, I think it goes back to the masculine and feminine energy that we were talking about earlier, and the patriarchal society that we're so ingrained in, where this energy of bending, of flexibility, of the not knowing the answers and being okay with that formless void and that formless space that opens up, being the feminine, which is what we've suppressed so much in society. We honor, and as a society collectively, we shape and we look for and we praise the masculine structure, that commitment to an ideal and the ability to hold to it without wavering. Yes. That's a very much of a masculine principle, but it does get in the way of the free flowing movement of this feminine energy that we're saying might break through.
Yeah, and they really need each other. It's not that the masculine needs to go. It's the fact that it's been so overemphasized. I mean, if you talk to any kind of like Chinese medicine person, they're going to tell you that everybody has a yang imbalance in this culture because there's just way too much emphasis on like doing rather than just being and producing and becoming and objectification of like the body and the personality. I mean, all of that has a certain hardness to it that really becomes kind of built up over time, like calcified. Yeah, you need water to kind of wash that calcification away.
Yeah, the way that I described it this way in my last conversation with David, and I've really been thinking about this a lot since then, but you mentioned the flow of chi, right? I know that you have also practiced and teach yoga and breath work, considerable amount. And in studying those ideas and kind of the Eastern philosophy of energy, specifically around the Indian idea of prana and the nadis that it goes through, right? The nadis being the channels. There is this idea that the way that I conceptualize it is we are nothing more than copper wires. We are conduits for this energy to flow through. And in the conversation with David, I love that this was something that he taught me, was the idea of topological segmentation. And so if you haven't listened to the episode 1 of the Mindbender podcast, this is a good plug for it, but because he describes it way better than I can now. But he describes reality almost as this, a balloon, right? Like a carnival, a circus balloon almost. And, you know, like you can have these long balloons and you twist them up and you can make animals and shapes out of them. And this is what he describes consciousness and reality to be. It's this idea of topological segmentation, where consciousness at large is just the balloon. It's the space, the plane of the surface area of that balloon. But then as you twist the balloon and make this animal out of it, you get pinch points, you get nodes. And that's what individual consciousness is. It's the pinch points in, because consciousness, this energy, this prana or chi that we all are, and that we all are tapping into, it's just the balloon. It's just all of the space that makes up everything and in everyone. But the individuals are like the pinch points. As you twist up the balloon and you make these nodes, you get the segmentation of the full topology of the balloon. And that's what I believe, and what I'm hearing you describe consciousness and individual identity to be. It's almost like, as I described, the copper wire, it's as if we have friction. There's electrical resistance in the wire as the electricity tries to move through there. And as it bumps up against the edges of the pipe, as it encounters the friction that is unique to my individual identity, the ego, the idea of Reed Bender that I've built up. And I have, I'm thankful to say, I can't say I've had real trauma in my life, but everybody in life experiences trauma, right? It's not unique to say that there is trauma that happens just in the course of living. All of those things, the pain of existence builds up this resistance in the pipe. It adds friction into there, where everything then as I see the energy flowing through my unique conduit, it hits the resistance in that channel and it says, okay, that's unique to me. That is something that's I am that. And it's identifying as the node in the twisted up balloon. Whereas when you unravel the balloon, right? If you could imagine a circus clown makes this balloon animal, but then you rewind the course of time and you unwind the whole balloon till it's just a straight tube again. And all of the consciousness, all of the topology of that space is just a single, clean, open, frictionless void. And I think, and I'd love to kind of get your perspective on that and maybe bounce off of that idea of that being really what consciousness is it is a universal, omnipresent energy of that space. But then as it moves through each of our individual pinch points, that's where we get unique identity, but that's also where we get suffering. And
where we get unique expression.
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
So it's not a bad thing.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No. And I think that there's this misinformation out there that we kind of tout, which is the idea that if you do these spiritual practices, you'll become just that empty balloon. And that you'll lose all of that pinch point. This is the idea of like, you'll lose your ego, or like, you know what I mean? You won't be bound by that anymore. And there's truth to that depending on what your practice is and where it takes you. But I also think that's not something to be like headed for.
That's not
like,
the goal.
To me, no, it's not like the ego just goes away and you never suffer from that again, It's just that doesn't become the thing that's in the center of the room that is the most important thing happening all of the time. Mm-hmm. So you go from being very self-identified by being more ecosystem identified. Mm-hmm. And that's not happening in the mind in a conceptual way, but it's happening in an experiential way where your system becomes less oriented around what's happening inside and more oriented in a responsive manner to everything within you and outside of you.
It's the shift from reactivity to responsivity, where I'm no longer reactive when something happens that maybe my ego, my unique conduit of experience might say it runs counter to my preference or my ideal. And there is something that I have resistance to, maybe something that's happening in the present moment. And then as I pull away from that, as I pull away from the unique identification with my own perception of whatever is happening in the world, as I pull away from my unique experience of it and begin to see it as just, hey, this is a collective happening. I may have my opinion that I place on top of it, but this is just what's happening. I can either fall in line with it and be okay with it, or I can be anxious and angry against it. But that doesn't mean that we differentiate ourselves or remove ourselves from that unique experience entirely.
Yeah. And I would say that even below that, like that, what you're describing is kind of what begins to happen in the mind, or the conceptual idea, which is the first shift that really happens. Mm-hmm. But as things deepen, it goes way, it has to do with how your primal body is actually moving. It has to do with like a responsiveness or a networking in your environment that is at such a deep responsive level that it is guiding your movements. Your movements are no longer chosen in quite the same way. And so
I think you ride the wave is a phrase that you used earlier. I wonder if you might bring that back into this of like, what is that wave? You know, how, as you're describing this, do you move about the world differently? What is it that guides you if it's not your head at that point?
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. So the other day I was in line at this local place to get my smoothie in the morning for breakfast. And there were a bunch of people in front of me. And I was standing in the smoothie place and I was just noticing myself like looking around the room. And this is pretty common for me that when I get into a place with a lot of people, my field automatically starts networking the place. So my eyes are drawn in different places, my body may turn, my listening may happen, and I am not doing any of this. And stopping it is painful, like very, very hard to do and very painful. So I'm looking around and I'm kind of laughing to myself inside about how like chaotic all of this must look to anybody who was looking from the outside. And I locate this like little girl standing diagonally across from me. And she must have been like 17 months old, this cute little blonde girl. And I look at her and her body is doing the exact same thing. And I'm watching her. She's like staring over here at this guy. And then like a minute later, her eyes move over here. She is completely immersed in the experience. She looks down, somebody talks to her, she says something. She is just, and I'm like, holy shit, I'm a 17-month-old little girl. Like we're having the same thing going on, like me and this little girl. And it's innocence. Like it's just responsive. It's just right there all the time.
I bring this to the Christian idea of no one may enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become as a child once more.
Totally.
It's that childhood. It's the innocence of a child where you're not overlaying your preconceptions about the world onto the world, but you're listening to what the world is offering you and you're receptive to everything.
Exactly. And I would say that the negative or bad side of this is that my tolerance now for restrictive people or environments is very low. Like I really have a hard time with it. Like, and it can even be as restrictive as like over intellectualization, you know, like it's a shutting out of the fuller expression.
Yeah.
And in those spaces, I'm like, I got to get out of there. Like I can't be in those spaces anymore.
Yeah. Well, and it like, I think you made this point earlier about situations that might have been okay prior to the, you know, I'm sure you didn't have that same state of consciousness where you're like a 17-month-old child just scanning the room, right? I'm sure that took spiritual development and evolution, both consciously and just unconsciously as you've evolved, where that is this idea of chipping away, right? It's a slowly chipping away of all the things that you do overlay on the world from your own ego, from your own perspective, that you look out at the world and you project onto it from your own experience rather than listening to it and letting it come into you. And as you make that shift, what you're describing, you know, it gets more difficult to be engaged in those experiences, be engaged with those people, be engaged kind of in the world where you were suppressing that energy in you. You were not allowing it to flow freely. As you go further down this road and that energy becomes more and more expansive, more and more active in you, you know, it becomes more and more difficult, you know, a direct relationship to be engaged in those experiences that you once were really in on your life, but that you now recognize as being resistance to that same flow of natural energy.
Yeah. And I would say that like it used to be where you're in cooperation with that other way. But once you go through certain developmental arcs, you're no longer in cooperation with any of those ways. So what's interesting is that when I am in a room with that happening, if there are certain conditions that allow me to own my field, that are not asking me to give something away or asking me to participate. And even if I am asked, I usually try to like not do that because it's too uncomfortable. But what will happen is that the whole room will change because my presence is holding such a different frequency. And the frequency that I hold is existence. Like it's a very strong birthing of existence. And so it's interesting. People either feel very attracted to that or they really want to run from that. And friends of mine have watched it. They're like, you walk into the room and you can see what is happening and you could not even open your mouth, just stand there. And it's a fascinating thing. And I think this is what we're meant to do. We're meant to bring this into the world. We are meant to be non-cooperative in the best sort of way and to birth our existence in a field that is strong enough to pollinate and inform others around us from that vibrancy that we constantly have contact with. And that is, to me, that goes beyond what we currently conceptualize as healing. That's resolution kind of work. That's divinity work.
Yeah. Well, and there's a quote that I love because what you're describing, right, you have a visceral feeling of your field expanding and you're holding, you said a frequency, you're holding that current in the world that it's very rare and that people around you are not. And so some people will be attracted to it very strongly. Other people will be, have a very strong aversion to it. And so I'd love to kind of more get down really just grounded truth here as to what that actually feels like in your auric field, in your body when that's happening. Because for most people, myself included, for all of my life, even when for a long time, I just denied the existence of chakras, of auric fields, of energy bodies, all of that. I just rejected it outright entirely.
And then the divine was like, ha, 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 ha.
Yeah, exactly. And then it ripped me out of that and it said, okay, here, look at it. You still want to reject it?
Good luck.
Yeah, exactly. Like, look at it, feel it, see it. You still don't think it's real? Like that happens to people.
Yes.
But even so, there's a lot of resistance to it. And there's a line from the book by, it's called The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Would highly recommend it to anybody. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It really changed my life. But there's a line in it and this is the goal of alchemy, to bring spiritual perfection into contrast with the material plane. Yes. And it very much sounds like that is the current that you're holding. That is the energy of you're plugged in, right? It's almost as if like I've had the download come through to me once. It's just the line, just the quote, we are batteries that plug into the universe. And it's become a mantra for me. But it sounds like that's in that coffee shop when you were standing around and holding that current, you were plugged in. You were plugged into divinity. You were plugged into the world. And you were holding both of those simultaneously. You were engaged in the world, looking around. You weren't off in the Himalayas in a meditative trance. You were very much in the world, going about your daily life, but still holding that current. You were still channeling that spiritually divine energy through your being, through your aura, and holding it in contrast with the material plane.
Yeah.
And so I would love to really bring this into a grounded reality. What does that feel like for you in your body, in your auric field? Because again, the aura is something that even if you do believe it, even if you've seen a diagram of the chakras, right? Very few people have had an experience of it, know what it feels like. And so as you're holding that current and you say that you feel it alive in you, how does your body shift energetically from one state of being into another?
So my field moves super fast. So my perception is almost always changing. So people who it's terrible. Mm-hmm. I definitely had to get used to living in a world where if you could imagine a kaleidoscope, that kaleidoscope, you turn it and like you have these fractal turns and like you see something different. That's my reality all the time. So there's no steady state of perception for me. And I would say that in general, what I experience is just a lot of expression, a lot of movement, and a lot of what I describe as kind of like dance or harmonizing, where there's a lot of expansive access and things might look chaotic, but there's threads that run through that chaos, kind of energetic threads that my consciousness can follow. There was a time where I couldn't identify those threads and I was like walking in circles or like couldn't get anything done. It's still a little bit like that for me early in the day. I mean, this is high level creativity. This is like,
you said that this was a shift. This is not something that you've had your whole life. This is not something that you were born with. There was presumably something that happened to you, and this has been a development, an ongoing process of opening to this type of energy, this type of experience. Is that correct?
Yeah. Before I was just normal and intuitive.
Just normal and a little intuitive. Yeah. And then what happened? Yeah. And then what?
Well, and then actually I went on the second meditation retreat that I went on that particular year. So I had sat retreats for many years, but that year I went on 2. And in this particular retreat, I was maybe about 3/4 or 2/3 of the way through the retreat. And I had been sitting in silence for maybe 2.5 hours, just unmoving, very, very quiet. It was a very quiet retreat for me. And my consciousness was like, I wonder what's in the silence. And in that moment, I heard and saw or perceived vibrating molecules of possibility.
Molecules of possibility. So you saw... Yes. You're not talking about anything physical here. You didn't see the chair in front of you. You saw in your consciousness, in the field of your awareness, presumably your eyes closed, these vibrating packets of energy that were potential, that were possibilities.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Wow.
Yep. And I saw that they were always there, that this was always the case, and that this was the way in which everything became something. And so I had this maybe like 5 minutes with that. Like this was unremarkable, Reed. You know what I mean? Like I had already had the remarkable experiences where I was like in bliss and transcendence and couldn't feel my feet and my feet were heavy, like all that shit.
Yeah.
This was not that. This was highly unremarkable, other than the fact that I saw it. I knew it. It informed me. And I had been sitting with a lot of darkness for a couple of years. I had been churning through some past, like a lot of different imprints of darkness, and a lot of heart's work. And I was aware that in that moment, it was light. But I really was not aware of what had happened through me until I left retreat and went out into a normal environment. And once that happened, I was very aware. And so that started kind of a process that has been going on for a little over 7 years of what I thought at the time was going to be, we can have these encapsulated experiences with divinity where like we have a thing that happens and then we metabolize or incorporate that energy and then life kind of goes back to being a human.
I feel like that's most people who are listening to this, whether they have or have not had a psychedelic experience, that's all that is. It's described as an elevator, right? You're taken all the way up to the top floor. You see this incredible party that's happening, and then you're taken back down to the ground floor and you're said, okay, go back and live your life. David Field described it as you're pulled out of the shoebox. You're forced to look around at the world and say, okay, hey, see everything else that's out there, put back in the shoebox into 3 dimensions and say, okay, go live your life with that knowledge. Nothing's going to change in your experience. Your life's going to be the same, but you have that awareness. And there's other people like yourself, and as you're describing, and very differently, and myself for different reasons to a different extent, but there are other people who have these experiences and their lives are never the same. Their day-to-day experience has been shifted.
Well, you become something different. So I became something different. Like
that's a really good way to put it.
Everything. Nothing has been left out. And that's not about the externals. It's about the internals, and it's all about relationship. And so everything got reorganized, and I thought it was going to be like a box that closed, and it was like, okay, life. But no, it's apparently like a thing that I am now. And so then there was a whole learning curve about learning how to work with a thing that I am in the context of being a single mom in in a Western world, raising a child. And so there's so many of those things that are just against you becoming something else. And so many of those things are things that caused me a lot of suffering that had nothing to do with me or my process, but had to do with the externals that didn't support that process.
Would you describe that as a dark night?
I mean, I definitely would say I have spent many years in hell. I think that there was a portion of it at the beginning that felt like a dark night, but then it didn't feel like a dark night anymore. It just felt like it was about learning hell, and learning what the exits from hell are.
But experiencing it viscerally in yourself.
All the time. Being woken up in terror for 8 years, every single night, being tortured energetically. I mean, like, dealing with all sorts of resistance energy coming towards me from all forms, both embodied and disembodied. Having false paths, things that look like they're the path that you head down and it's actually a red herring. Like, I've had the full experience of what it is to be in the dream time on multiple different levels in a multidimensional scale all the time without it ever stopping.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that opens you up to so much beauty and the potential as, even not to convolute this with your experience of the vibrating packets of potential energy, but just like of the whole, everything you've just described wrapped up into whole encapsulation of just who you are and what you've experienced. The potential that creates for change,
it's massive.
For good, like the love and the beauty you can bring into the world there. I can't even begin to characterize, only you can from your experience. Yeah.
Yeah. It's massive. It's massive. I say almost all the time that my field now will sort what isn't love, and it will purposefully either just ignore it, like it just will not engage at all with what isn't love, or it will disintegrate it. Like it will just go towards it without me doing anything. It just builds on itself over time, where it becomes a body of itself, and the body of itself just grows in magnitude and in strength.
I love that you described it and went in the direction of love, because that's exactly the next question I was going to ask you. I'll quote Jung again, because he's been one of my largest influences. I've really respected him and learned a lot from him. And there's a quote that he has: "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And I'm very much picking up on that from you. It very much sounds like what you're describing of you've been through, and sounds like, still deal with those hellish encounters, that suffering, that pain. There's so much in you that it sounds like is just torture. But with that, it almost like that comes hand in hand. You can't just have the love. You don't just have the suffering. But it's then what you do when you were one thing in your life, but then all of a sudden you have this, it's almost like a walnut cracked open in your heart. And all of a sudden now you're facing this just magnitude of love, but it comes with so much suffering and so much pain that you just feel, not only for yourself and in your own life, but collectively, just suffering of the world collectively. And so where I'm going with all of this is really just kind of asking you to expand on what you just said. And what is the process of alchemy like for you, of turning all of that into a positive force in the world, into something that brings more love and more connection into those around you?
I mean, I think it happens through me now. So I don't really know all the time what that process is. Like, it's just in each moment it's happening. But what's interesting, I think, that I didn't understand before is that, so there's these layers to things. And what I contacted, not just at that retreat, but what I contacted many, many times on journeys afterwards. And these were not like journeys where I was going to like sit with a group of people and try to journey. This was like I would wake up in the morning and I was taken. So I was like continually taken over and over again, very interestingly, to this base fire of creation that comes before form. And so it's like this just column of fire that exists and is existence. And the templates for form kind of dance around this column of fire.
The templates for form. Could you,
yes,
what do you mean by
sacred geometry? So think about like templates based on sacred geometry, right? They could be everything as simple as a square or a triangle or a hexagram, all the way to more complex, like the feather or the wing of a bird, right? If you pull out a feather from the wing of a bird and you look at it, it has all of the geometry that is encoded to create that bird.
There is an idea that exists before the form. And what you're seeing is the idea.
Yes, the templates are kind of like the architecture of the idea or the architecture that becomes the form. So how I was seeing it over and over again is that these templates are kind of like dancing around this column of fire. And imagine them just like little people ecstatically dancing around this column of fire.
Okay.
And so what would happen is that like the fire would alight a template. And in that moment of the fire alighting the template, creation was born. Something was born in that moment. And so I was taken not only to there, but all of the layers that then live on top of that. And some of those layers are hell realm layers. Some of those layers are bliss layers. Some of those layers are just normal consciousness existence layers. And so what I learned was that for me, I couldn't get attached to experiencing any of those layers because my field was already holding the entirety of it from the base all the way, quote unquote, up through different cooperations of expressions. And that, as you were saying, the hell realm can't exist without like the love realm or whatever. And so they have a cooperative experience with each other. So I had to learn that when my consciousness was waking up in the hell realm, I couldn't be attached to it because I just happened to be waking up in that particular layer at that particular time. Now, when it kept going, there was definitely something that was drawing me to that layer to understand something or recover something or see something more differently that had importance. But this is the way it really is for all of us. It's just where our awareness is how narrow or wide that is.
So I'd love to bring this out and still in the context of your experience, but directly speaking now to people who might be listening to this podcast who have had these expansive experiences, have touched that pulsating energy in their chest. But as we're describing, it's not just bliss. It's not just love. It's also the hell realms. It's also the suffering that's also alive in that pulse. So somehow this divinity that we're talking about, this divine source of creation, that column of light that you experienced, the forms dancing around, it is a balance of both polarities. It's a balance of both the light and the darkness. But so many people, and I speak from experience here, who begin waking up to that dimension in their lives, oftentimes are thrown into the hell before they're allowed to see the light. And I say that, maybe allowed is not the right word, but for so many people, it's characterized by the hell experience. And there's so much resistance. There's so much seemingly in the way of getting to that point of the experience where it is bliss, where it is love. And this is where I think the idea of like, chasing the dragon comes in, because if you do it on psychedelics or if you do it on breath work, all of a sudden, this is, I think Ram Dass calls it the golden chain, where you become attached to that method. You just keep taking psychedelics, or you don't do anything but breath work, or you sit in zazen meditation for hours on end, chasing that experience you had prior. And coming from that place of lack like that, when you feel like you don't have it and you're chasing after it, that experience is characterized by suffering. So what could you say from your experience, both personally and in psychotherapy, and in your experience working with these energies? What advice can you give to people who are waking up to these dimensions of possibility in their lives, but have lost maybe the bliss that came through in the initial breakthrough, and now all they see is the suffering? All they see is the hell realms, and they're stuck.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. I think one of them is the fact that like the hell realm is also love. So they're not separate. The hell realm is also love. And the fact that I think we get stuck there longer because our resistance is so high there. So the work there is really around working with resistance as well as working with content. And we can't go against resistance because that's more resistance. So we have to understand what the resistance is born from and what it's continually being born from inside of us, which is generally some version of, I don't want pain and suffering. Like that's usually what it boils down to.
It's still stuck in the duality of chasing pleasure and avoidance of pain. Yeah.
Yes. And I would say that a part of this is that we also don't have enough places where people can be held to just go into that pain and feel like they're being fed. Somebody is listening to them that understands. I mean, this would markedly change the length and like the duration and intensity of our rides in this place.
Well, there's such an aversion to that pain. There's again, I speak from experience here, where as I was in that place where the dimensions had opened up to me, the light had come through, but all of a sudden it was gone. And I was just stuck in this place of this liminal space, as you described prior, of I hadn't fully been birthed into something new, but everything around me was falling away. And in that place, one thing that I turned to was weed. I smoked a lot, and I used it very much as a crutch during that time because I felt stuck. I felt like I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. And it was an escape. It was a crutch for me. Yeah. So maybe in that context, like what are the ways that people might just avoid it entirely and try and mask from that experience, that when they're stuck in that view of avoiding pleasure or avoiding pain and chasing pleasure, what are some of the ways that we mask it, and how might that perpetuate addiction, make it worse?
Yeah. I mean, I always say that like part of any emergent experience, kind of like holding space or integration space, should be informed by understanding addiction. Because it is the number one thing that is going to show up, because it's how we relate or don't relate to pain and to suffering, and how we try to medicate that pain and suffering or numb ourselves to it. So, I mean, it can show up as like people start drinking. Like there's a great, Christina Groff, Stanislav Grof. Yeah. So like she had a great part in one of the books that I read so many years ago, where she was talking about how like one of her awakenings happened during childbirth, and she like became an alcoholic for like 8 years sometime after that, and then had to go about the process of like remedying her alcoholism because it had taken over her life. So, I mean, I think it can be like having a bliss experience and falling in love with somebody and thinking that they're the one, and quitting your job and your marriage and going off with them. It can be weed. It can be going to the Himalayas and becoming a monk. Like, it's really just about the fact that we feel so incapacitated by that level of depth of pain that and usually most people go into this without the right prep. This is the other thing, is like thank God for me, I had a long meditation practice. You know what I mean? Like I had serious skills. So when shit started going down, I had anchors for myself in my practice. But most people, they're like, oh my God, I'm 45. My life is terrible. I'm going to Peru to drink ayahuasca. You know, they do like 2 ceremonies. They come back and they are a hot mess.
How do you then plug back into the life you had left previously? Yeah.
Totally. And they have not integrated. They had no previous practices for any of this. You need practices. You need like hygiene practices. You need, you know, scaffolding that helps you to incorporate big energies.
Yeah. I love that point. I'll take this a bit abstract and we can bring it back into the ground in a second. Really, the distinction, again, between Eastern and Western religions, I think is very relevant here because that's something that I've studied a lot. And I think it really resonates here because one thing that I think, if we're going to differentiate, put Eastern traditions and Western traditions side by side, I think that the Eastern traditions, again, going back to that feminine masculine polarity, you have the Eastern traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Sufism, whatever it might be. And they're very action oriented, right? You go to a Buddhist monastery and it's, okay, here's your practice, Zazen, breathwork, meditation, whatever it may be, there's practices. It is so it's action. There's a directive orientation to it. That's, you want to achieve spiritual bliss, enlightenment. Yes. You want to open up to these dimensions of possibility. Do this. Just go do the practice. But where it falls short is in social action and in the love and in the compassion, because as you're describing, you know, you can just go off and become
It doesn't address the double bind.
It doesn't address the double bind. And there's also people who are just, it's an escape. Eastern tradition is very much of an escape from reality, whereas going back to the other polarity where you have Western traditions, speaking mainly of Christianity, of my tradition and my heritage, which I still hold very dearly. With Christianity, it's the opposite problem, where it's so plugged into the love and the compassion and the social action. But never in all of my childhood of going to church was I given anything to do. I was never given any practice to bring me closer to that domain of possibility in myself. So I was never told about breathwork. I was never told about meditation. I was never told that an encounter with Christ was possible in my own consciousness if I did X, Y, Z. It was very much projected outside of me, and it was just focus on the love, just focus on what you believe. It's all about, you know, more in your head, and there's no action-oriented principles. There's nothing to do, and people are craving. People are miserable. People are hurting, and they want something to do to help them get out of their pain and out of their suffering. And I think that really this is going to come with a marriage of the Eastern and the Eastern and the Western traditions, where you bring in the compassion and the love of Christ, but you also integrate some of the practices of the East to really begin to offer what you're describing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, in general, we need more of a marriage of everything. Mm-hmm. Like, everything is kind of not enough on its own. And the complexity that we have become as humans, particularly because of the ability to be on the internet and to connect globally. I mean, it has built so much more technological complexity in our ability to be related. And we have not caught up in ways that have met that. And we feel it. We feel our consciousness kind of living way back here, yet all of these things are available to us right here. And we don't really have the systems that help us marry all of that into one frame or view that allows it to expand wide enough to encapsulate all of those different aspects of the way that we live.
Mm-hmm. And we're so not at a place where that's even, like, people don't understand that that's a possibility. It feels like there's very few people actually looking for that marriage.
It's true.
And so I guess going back to the individual, right? The individual who is in the process of this, who maybe has entered into the dark night. That's one part. That's one point. And we've addressed that. And then there's this whole other subset of society that there's people who are out there looking for answers and who are trying to encounter these spaces of of potential in their own consciousness. And there's other people who still outrightly reject that it's even possible. And there was something I posted on, it was like an Instagram reel yesterday, and it was a quote that just really struck me. It's like, I call it quantum feedback. Witches call it spells. Christians call it prayer. Scientists call it quantum physics. Everybody believes it exists. We're just arguing over its name. Nobody denies its existence of this potential, this space of possibility, right? Because when you pray, that's what you're doing. You're praying to you're feeling, you're embodying the emotion of what you're hoping to attract into your life. And you're asking a higher power. You're giving up control and you're saying, this is bigger than me. There is a God. There is something out there that I'm asking to intervene on my behalf. And so, but that is still being so much projected outside of us. There's this rejection still that is something that we can encounter directly.
Yes. Or that we are.
We are it. Yeah.
We are it.
And so, but how, because you've worked with this, this is exactly you talk about being in the coffee shop, right? And you are it, you're embodying it, you're holding that current, bringing spiritual perfection into contrast with the material plane. But how then, what does that look like in mass, at large? How can we begin to adopt these ideas collectively in a way that is not, because in a way that's non-dogmatic, because it's so difficult to have these conversations and point people in the direction, people are obsessed with the finger that's pointing at the moon and completely missing the moon entirely.
Totally.
So collectively, what does that look like for you? How do you hold that current and try and help people in this domain as they're going through these experiences when there's a massive subset of the collective society that doesn't even, that just calls you crazy?
Yeah. I think I actually don't have that many people who call me crazy. So I feel lucky about that like somehow the marriage of those things in me seems to be very humanized where people relate to it. But I know exactly what you're saying, which is like, how do we pollinate this in a way in which... That's a
very good word. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've thought a lot about that, obviously, with a lot of time to think. So I thought a lot about that, which is, some of it is creating larger coalitions or larger bodies that have already been pollinated by this. So there's a way that one field that holds that informs other fields. So if you and I were to have weekly conversations for the next 5 to 8 weeks, your field would begin to change. And over time, maybe over 6 months or 8 months, your field would be a holder of some of the things that my field holds. And I've done this with people. So I only know it happens because people have told me.
Sure, yeah.
And so you begin to kind of like have that information in your bodies that is at a deep enough space where even though your interpretation or delivery might be different than mine, you're becoming informed by it. And so in many ways, there's a way to like create kind of what I've been shown as hives. So there's a way to create kind of these tight teams or tight groups that hold this field together, and that actually begins to then replicate. The hexagram is so easy to replicate, right? And so it becomes where it can be replicated. And what happens is it literally just becomes pollinating, like it just spreads. And there's tangible ways to do that too. Like I have business plans to like get funding and put certain things in certain places. But the combination of the energetics and the business piece of it, or the plans, I think is how it begins to have the possibility of creating information systems that are hubs for communities, not just individuals, but whole communities. And now you're informing. It's like if you throw a stone into the water, there's a small ring and a larger ring and a larger ring. And what happens is it just begins to kind of like inform wider bodies.
Well, and I love this idea because it goes back to what we were talking about before of how it's a direct current that gets passed, right? Where as you're describing this, you're standing in the coffee shop and your field is embodying that place where you are fully, you're feeling all of that energy coursing through you. You're in energetically, your heart is in that place where it's open and you're seeing the world around you from that place of divinity.
Yes.
And it's clear to me, and I imagine that I hope that people will have this experience that will relate with this, where when you're in the presence of something like that, it is infectious. It's a current that gets passed to you. In the same, I mean, try not to smile when somebody next to you is hysterically laughing. It's the same. It's the same thing.
Right.
But it's so easy. There's such a fine line there because I see that's what you're describing. But where does that then cross over into the idea of projecting the power, projecting the authority outside of yourself to a guru figure, right?
I mean, I think like it depends on the person carrying the field. Like I'm not interested. Like people don't do that with me because they don't even know half the stuff that I told you today. Mm-hmm. They don't need to. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm not cultivating that in any of my discourse or relationships.
Sure.
So most of the time it's pretty invisible, like what I may be carrying mm-hmm. or the place in which I got to what, or whatever the hell all of that is. Like that's not part of, it's not part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Unless I get to a place with people like I'm training, and then it becomes part of the conversation because it has a different context for it.
Right. But it's very context aware like that. And the reason that I ask is this is such a big part, like in India, right? The tradition was always guru to disciple. It was something that these were protected ideas. These things were passed like a physical current. You know, you touch somebody. I visualize it like the Tesla coil, right? That makes your hair stand on end and you can hold hands in a chain and you tap the finger of somebody at the end and they have a big shock. It's quite literally like that, where it's passed like a current. But it's futile to deny that sometimes people that, whether they do or they just claim to, whatever it might be, that hold that position of somebody with some kind of spiritual power, whether it's actually held and justified or they're charlatans just trying to lead others to power. Both of those happen. And really where I see it, and I'd love your perspective on this, is that we're stepping into a world as these experiences are happening with increasing frequency where there is no guru. You are the guru. You're the one that is responsible for your own evolution, for your own development. But
you have the code.
You have the code, but that doesn't mean you need to do it in a bubble. That doesn't mean you have to do it in isolation. There are people who you can look to for support without looking to them as gurus. And I don't really, I'm kind of going down this rabbit hole without a clear direction, but I'm really just trying to wrestle in my own head with that line of when I'm looking for somebody, when I'm looking to somebody to try and get support and advice and spiritual evolution, where does the line cross from teacher to guru?
Yeah. Well, and I think a piece of this that I'll jump into based on what you're saying is that because we have a whole culture that is so young in its maturation and so deeply dependency oriented in the realm of like seeking something externally, it just translates into this same thing where like you need that person to be the thing. You need them to be the thing that's going to save you. Nothing is going to save you. There's no saving to be had. And so I tell people this over and over again, like I have a body of information that I have acquired. And that body of information can probably give you a context that is going to be highly beneficial for you to interpret your experiences, your life, and your relationships in totality. That is what I have. I can coach you. Like you can come to me and say, this, and this is happening, and I will place you within my context of this maps and know how to give you practices or advice based on what you're saying. But ultimately, you're walking it. Mm-hmm. And I don't encourage any dependency from anybody who works with me. Like, there's no part of me that is interested in that. And they feel it. They know it. So they don't react with that.
Yeah, it's very much, it's not like you are the one in control of that. If you are the one that is putting out the energy, you can choose to embody
That's right.
an ego that says, I'm the reason, I'm the one, all these incredible things.
I don't want all those people to be like following me like that. That's a burden for me. I want to be free. Do you know what I'm like? That's going to be like laborious and boring. I don't want that. So I think that that's the other thing is like my being is invested in continuing to like evolve at whatever pace feels like it's not being held by anything. And so there's no interest for me.
Yeah. And so really just going from there, we've already hit the 2-hour mark and I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to ask kind of follow up with this conversation and we can lead to the end from here. You have these experiences, and whether or not to the listeners, whether or not you have touched, and it's, it when you felt this place inside of yourself, right? It leaves a mark. You can go back to it.
Yes, it does.
There is something in your life, even if it is just climbing a mountain and having that just jaw-dropping experience of awe at the natural world. That is an encounter with the divine. And I keep going back to this because it is happening with increasing frequency in the world, right? And we still, at this day, don't even have a DSM, a medical categorization for it. So you have these spiritual, quote, experiences that might happen to you. And if you go to your psychiatrist or a general practitioner and your doctor, you're going to get diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD, right? There is no clinical classification of this, which that's what the entire Western model of medicine is built off of divide and conquer, diagnose and treat. There's not a collective holistic view of it. And so I really want to go from that point of saying this is happening in the world with increasing frequency and we have no container for it at all.
Yes.
So I'll leave this question to you open-ended and let you take it wherever you want. What does the world look like 10 years from now in this context?
Cooperative.
Cooperative in the sense of communities, smaller communities working together on everything, or cooperative in terms of psychology, kind of expand on that. From
the internal organization of cooperation to the community organization of cooperation, to the cooperation with the ancestral layer and what came before us, to the cooperation with the earth and its cycles. I mean, I don't think this is going to be achieved in 10 years,
right?
But I think this is the direction that consciousness is already taking itself. And something that people don't understand is that they are in a dance with consciousness. So consciousness is going wherever the hell it wants. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's going to be in reaction or in response to some of what we do. If we continue to destroy more, consciousness will destroy other things that are destructive in a negative way. Like, this is the thing, is that we're always in the dance. We're never out of the dance. Even when you think you're hiding, you're still in the dance. And so once you recognize you're in the dance, which I also call as being in the game, right? Once you recognize that you're in the dance or in the game, you're really learning how to dance your dance with the dance. And so I think that we are going to see things continue to accelerate. I think we're going to see big structures continue to break down. I think we're going to see a lot of emergent solutions, some of which can't stand the test of time. They're going to be things that look amazing and glittery, and they are not going to be rooted in enough they're not going to be rooted in enough breadth and depth to stand decades of evolution. So I think we're going to see that popping up all over the place. I think we're going to see it popping up with a lot of money behind it, and you're going to see it arc and leave. And then I think underneath that, you're going to begin to see these things that have been seeded by some of us for a long time. And those seeds are going to begin to just gently and gradually keep doing their thing. And at some point, you're going to see them emerge into things that have much deeper, older, deeper roots. And those things are going to
revival.
be, yeah, exactly. Because really, in some ways, nothing is new. Everything, we're just repurposing things that have already been there. But the longitude and depth of your repurposing dictates in some ways the ability for it to stand the test of time.
Well, and we have these religious traditions, right? Even going all the way back to shamanism, right? You say that there's no religious text of shamanism, but of course there are. There's oral traditions and things that have been written down, and
mystical traditions.
You have the esoteric traditions of Hermeticism and Rosicrucianism and all of the Eastern mysticism, and Christianity, which holds such a deep and rich understanding of this that's veiled and often misunderstood, but it's there. All of these traditions have this current embedded in it. So, I mean, the same way we say that people hold a current and can pass it on, all of these religions hold it too. Even the ones that people look at as horrible obfuscations of the true spirit. You know, I don't want to name, I mean, there's poorly misguided religious traditions, and even those are rooted in this current. And somewhere in there, there's a kernel of truth that might have been manipulated and warped. And this is everywhere. And one thing that really I go to is in the course of evolution, right? Like, where is all of this going? Because it's there, right? We've had the traditions embedded in mysticism, embedded in religions, but we've kind of missed the mark. We've missed what it's actually meant. And this is a idea of the course of evolution where consciousness is just emerging complexity. It's bringing order and bringing coordination and, what was the word that you used? Cooperation of individuals. And it's forming tight-knit groups and communities. And it's two individual pieces beginning to work together as a unified whole. And as you do that throughout the course of evolution, right, we had single-celled organisms that combined into multicellular organisms. You had mitochondria that hopped into eukaryotes and led to what we have now with human biology and mammals. And following the course of evolution, you know, for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, millions of years, it was just the process of natural selection that led to this increasing complexity on the earth. We went from single-celled organisms to fungi to reptiles to mammals. You had this kind of linear progression of increasing complexity in the world. And one thing that Terence McKenna, and this was one of his ideas that I really appreciate, is that we've now moved beyond that, where it's no longer natural selection that's holding the baton of consciousness as actor, right? If consciousness as a force is trying to evolve and increase complexity on the earth. Well, with humans, we hit the point where we evolved and we had thought, we had all of a sudden writing came into the picture. We could formulate our thoughts in words. And for thousands of years, then we had books come up, right? And this takes thousands and thousands of years of evolution to whereas now we have technology, we have the internet, and we as human beings are the ones that hold the baton of increasing complexity on the earth. It's no longer just the slow turn of time evolving animals and natural selection. It's innovation on this planet is coming through technology, through creation, our own creative impulse to, we have an idea and then we build it in the world and we put it out there. And that is what consciousness is doing. Consciousness is constantly evolving, increasing orders of complexity on the planet, to the point where now we are all interconnected with the internet. And that's just a fractal of what consciousness actually is doing.
Yes.
But tying this all back to what I was originally saying with the religious traditions that hold the current, you know, we live in a culture now that is so materialistic and revolts against anything with religious connotations. And I really see this as somehow all of those traditions, not any one of them in particular, but there's going to be this revival of all of the religious traditions that come in and we say, wow, there's so much wisdom here that if we can merge this with the technology, with the innovation that we are now spearheading, what kind of world can we birth with this understanding, with this current we hold in ourselves of consciousness, of love, and of light, and then combine that with the rational understanding of the technology we can innovate on.
Sure.
What is that going to build in the world in 10, 15, 50, 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ingredient from that's going to be really necessary is maturity. And that's the ingredient that we're missing. So I think we have access to all of this information in both lines of the spectrum of what you said. We have all this technological advancement possibility, and we have all this information on mystical traditions that are at our fingertips on some level and that we're trying to encounter. But what we don't have is maturity. And we don't have a lot of examples of maturity. And that alone, I think, is where it is going to be deeply problematic. This is what to me, this is the core piece that humans are going to have to wrestle with until any kind of harmony or cooperation can really be found, which is around working with real maturity. You cannot hide behind your wounds. You cannot use other people to project your shadow material onto. You have to become accountable to what is coming through you, out of you, and within you. And we have very, very few people who have that level of accountability.
And I think that, again, I'm speaking definitely from a level of ignorance here, but it is coming anecdotally from a level of experience of that accountability and that responsibility comes hand in hand with the breakthrough of this source, of this spirit, of that pulsing life inside of us. As soon as you touch that place, there is...
I don't know about that.
Please correct me on this.
I don't know.
Go. Yeah, I'd love your perspective
I would
on
say that actually that's a whole other journey. Like you touch that place or you touch it a couple times, right? And I think that there's many choice points still along the way where you decide whether you are going to actually choose kind of the easy way, perceived, the easy way or the growth way. Like, I think there's a lot of exits for a while.
Okay. So I'll reformulate where I was going with it. And then see if this maybe resonates more closely. The touch point with that energy, with that source in each of us, it forces us to confront with the question of, am I going to bury this? And because it's like, you can be unconscious of it and you can have this ignorance in your life. But then as soon as you recognize it, it's like Morpheus in the Matrix. If he's choosing, am I going to go back into the ignorance, or am I going to choose to stand up and have the responsibility of this knowledge that I'm now sitting with? It doesn't necessarily, the awareness of that spirit in each of us doesn't necessarily come with the automatic responsibility and accountability that Neo exhibits, but it forces you to address the question of, am I going to go back into my ignorant bliss, or am I going to pursue the responsibility and the accountability? And at that point, it becomes a choice. It's no longer unconscious. Is that maybe a better way of phrasing it?
Yeah. And I would say that choice shows up many times over. Like, it's not one time, because we often think it's one time, but it's not. You're going to encounter that choice over and over in a variety of conditions and states. Some that you might be more comfortable making that choice in, and some that you might be less. And so this is the thing, is that like maturity really is from recognizing impermanence, not being attached to too many states, but also recognizing what vibrancy is, and that you are in charge on some respects of being responsible for your aliveness. And that any lack of connection with that aliveness affects everybody around you. It holds them hostage.
Wow. I can't think of a better place to end with this, of that choice of taking, because you're right, it is a choice. It's one thing to have this whole conversation and only talk about the light and the love that opens up there with the foray into the darkness. But, all of that really is incomplete without the acknowledgement of the choice that comes with it. Because at that point, you're a conscious and responsible actor, choosing your direction, no longer following the reactions of your preconditioned biases, right? All of a sudden, now now it's a confrontation of which direction are you going to choose to go with this?
Yeah, and you need a certain degree of courage in those spaces. You need to have more courage or more willingness than you have fear. Mm-hmm. If the fear is disproportionate to the willingness, you will not choose that path. But you have to see the fear as another actor in the entire play, not as something that is against you or that you are mandated to follow, but as just another variable that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. A part of the experience, a part of yourself. You're looking at a part of yourself when you are confronted with those emotions.
Yeah.
And then it's, what do you do with it?
Yeah. It's how are you relating to it? It's always about, how am I relating to this? How is it relating with me, and how am I relating with it? And who am I, and what is it? And are we the same? And what's coming through? I mean, these are the right questions in those spaces.
And it's not something that you can come away from this conversation and then have a grip on. It's unique for everybody, as you've already said. And it's something that you can't be told, you can't be read in a book. It's something that is an experience. And it's something that is everybody has to wrestle with on their own, in their own heart and in their own head.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Well, the amount of wisdom that you've brought through in this conversation, and I really hope for people listening that maybe are in this point of the dark night, or maybe have had these experiences of energetic breakthroughs, but have absolutely no clue what to do with it. I really think that this conversation can be a bit of a guiding light. At the very least, just interesting. I mean, it's just fascinating to talk about these conversations and explore that, this actually exists in the world. It's not just something that people are making up. There are people who live with it daily, and it's a part of their lives. And there's something that's being birthed in the world that we are all just along with the ride for. And so I just personally want to say thank you for the work that you're doing in sharing this and being willing to talk about both your work and all of the just incredible work you've done in this field and in helping people through these experiences, but also for coming on and just explaining and expanding on your personal experience and what it's like for you subjectively. One of my favorite things that's come through in this podcast and in these conversations is not just the intellectual wisdom that people can bring, but explaining their own experience of encounters with source. I think the more of these stories that I can collect and share with the world, the more powerful the message will be. So thank you for sharing everything that you have in this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah, of course. Where can people find you?
Probably the best way is on my website, which is just breegreenberg.com.
Okay. Awesome.
It's the easiest.
Yeah. I'll link it in the video description so people can find you. Do you have any last words that you'd like to share with people listening?
I don't think so.
I think we've covered it.
It feels pretty complete.
We've been around. Yeah, we've been around the circle, but I just want to, again, just close it with thank you. You are a blessing, and what you're bringing into the world is very much needed. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Reed. Thank you.
Yeah. Chat soon. See ya.
Okay. Bye.